Each should know this, that is his self's own ideal is the standard by which the will is controlled or measured. Unless the ideal is founded in spirit, it must crumble, it must become dross. Obtaining the ideal is making use, spiritual use first. He without an ideal is sorry indeed. He with an ideal and lacking courage to live it is sorrier still. Is your ideal only in him? Are you in accord with your ideal? That which is done in the purpose, in the desire for meeting, and being one with the ideal, if the ideal is of the spirit of truth, is constructive. The attainment is limited only by how high the ideal is set, and as to how well the whole trust is put in that ideal. Upon time and space is written the thoughts, the deeds, the activities of an entity, as in relationships to its environs, its hereditary influence, as directed or judgment drawn by, or according to what the entity's ideal is. When trials and turmoils and tribulations arose yet remaining true, hence an ideal is as a governing influence in the entity's experience. What is thy ideal? Is it what ye may gain from others, or the position ye may occupy, that there may come to thy understanding, or thy hands those things that would direct? Or is it, that I may give myself, my life, my love, my all, that the glory of God may be manifested in the earth? Be hopeful, ever. For he is thy ideal, is the author of hope, dispeller of fear, the father of truth, light and understanding. If the ideal is always kept as the measuring stick, as it may be termed, the developments will come in the natural order of things or experiences. Please point the way in which I can enter into my life work and find true happiness. First study thyself and thy ideals, and know in spirit, in mind, in body thy ideal is surely in him as the savior of all mankind. He that is without an ideal is a wanderer, and if the ideal is set in material things it will soon play out and fade. The ideal must be in spiritual things. Study to show self-approved of thy ideal, and know and find what thy ideal is spiritually and mentally, and there need be little fear of the material results. If you justify yourself in the material, and then reason through the mind, it'll bring confusion for the entity. First as to all, know what is thy ideal. As to whether this applies to the now, the then, or the hereafter, as to whether to the mental, the material or the spiritual phase of man's experience. Know who is the author, and let not the blind lead the blind. But know that he to whom ye commit thy ideal is able to keep that which is promised against any experience that may arise in any phase of thy consciousness, now or hereafter. As the ideal is a growth, as the activities of the physical and mental consciousness through confidence brings that seeking of the mental and material body to awaken to the spiritual activities, so may the growth in faith bring the activating forces of the spirit that makes alive in the flesh. Keep the ideal before self, not only of its material relationships, not only in the material positions, but more so, in that the spiritual ideal is not lost sight of in all of the activity, in all of its relationships. Keep that as is set before thee as thine ideal, whether in relationships to individuals, home or abroad, and know that no temptation or trial is not accompanied with the way or manner of escape in thine ideal, else thine ideal is below the mark of the higher calling set in him. That which becomes ideal is the heart seeking for the knowing and doing the will of him that giveth light, life and understanding in all the experiences of those that seek to know his way. If the ideal is prompted by truth, no matter what may be the outward appearance, the assurance of filling and fulfilling the purpose for which the entity seeks expression in this experience in every phase of its consciousness, it will bring contentment, peace, harmony and the like. First, knowing within self that there is and can be an ideal, and that an ideal is a reasonable thing. Just as has been given of old, present the body a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto the giver of all good and perfect gifts, for this is a reasonable service. The purpose of each soul is to be a channel through which that is held as its ideal is to be made manifest, and that the glory of God be kept first and foremost. Then so live, so act as to be consistent in thy thoughts, thy acts, thy expressions. Not only in word but in deed. For being true to self will not make thee false to any. Know in whom as well as in what ye believe. Set an ideal, as to citizenship, as to parenthood, as to neighbor, as to manner of church service, as to manner of neighborly activity, as to thy spiritual, thy mental self. And then so live thine own life in those relationships that others would never question, as to what thy ideal is. The ideal is not as a material thing, not as only a mental experience, but as the mental, the material and the spiritual world. For life is the manifestation of that divine which is worshipped as God. Hence each soul entity is a portion of same, with that privilege through the experiences in materiality to manifest an ideal and thus grow in grace, in knowledge, in faith, in hope, in love, that the entity, the soul, may be one with the creative forces that should be the ideal of every soul. Know first that the experiences, the circumstances as confront the body are ways, means, manners through which the mental and soul self may find expression and development in the present experience. But that with the meeting of the problems there must be chosen by the body, that which is as a standard, that is an ideal. And that unless the ideal is set in spiritual aspects, spiritual promptings, it must eventually come to naught. This should be prompted from, and should be the desires of the mental self from that phase of the experience not merely idealistic but purposeful, and that self in all its relationships, all its opportunities, is giving of self in a manner in which that ideal is chosen by self, is shown forth in its dealings with its fellow man. If thine ideal is set in the material things, only material things can be the reaping or the harvest. If thine ideal is set in higher things, and thine acts day by day are in keeping with those, then the harvest may be expected to be in that proportion commensurate with that given. Measure self not by self, for who does such is unwise. What, then, is thine ideal? Is it founded in that ye yourself may do, or that in which ye may be the channel through which others may find their association with a living God, a living ideal, a living love, a living faith, a living experience of joy? These be they which are of the truth, and thus grow as does the Spirit of truth. First, know thy ideal in what and in whom ye have believed, and assuring self by the answer within as is given, thy spirit beareth witness with my spirit that such is true, and that the ideal is able to keep all ye may commit unto it against any experience that may arise in the mental, the material or the spiritual spheres of activity.